Hi, thanks for joining me. Today's presentation is going to focus on adapting literacy lessons for young learners. You will find that most of what we are already doing in early childhood really lends itself to language learning, because naturally that's what we're doing, teaching children about language and literacy. But there are a few things that we need to consider when we are teaching English language learners, or those children that are coming to our classroom with the primary or first language not being English. And we can also consider a lot of these strategies to be helpful for what we would call culturally or linguistically diverse students. So these are the students that come from cultural or linguistic backgrounds and may not represent the majority of the students in the classroom. So let's take a look at some of those ideas and strategies we want to consider when working with English learners. What do we need to remember about learning a new language? As a young L, going into the early childhood classroom, I'm usually not literate or have very few literacy skills that I've developed by now. So we can expect that they're going to learn literacy along with their peers. However, that gets complicated if you don't have the background in phonemic awareness or vocabulary, because you are still very dominant in your native language. We need to remember that children will acquire social language proficiency from about 6 months to 2 years. So in those first 6 months, the child is doing a lot of language learning, and you will hear them speaking with their friends, and they're going to sound like they pretty much have learned a lot of English, and they have. But that is not to be mistaken with academic language, and that academic language is what we really start to see when we ask them to do a lot of writing, to formulate sentences, to use proper grammar. And that academic language proficiency can take from 5 to 7 years. What the biggest difference between English learners and other learners has to do with sociocultural context. Learning how to communicate with different audiences in different contexts and settings. Learning what language is appropriate and what is not in those settings. And learning appropriate nonverbal behaviors and cues. How to read us from others in different contexts that they may not be used to. And most importantly, we have to remember that they do come with different world perspectives and experiences and understandings that are equally as valuable as ours, but may not be the same as ours. What the biggest difference between English learners and... Now that we have a little more background, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How do I teach differently for L's? Well, let's look at some of the literacy needs that English learners might have. We need to pay particular attention to these. Words and meaning. How to pronounce new words and what they mean. So they may have a different phonemic language system, and that's where we get accents from. Because as young learners, you develop a particular way to pronounce words that are native to your tongue, and your mouth becomes accustomed to making those sounds. Luckily, young English learners can adapt to sounds a bit more flexibly and quickly than adults. But they still need to learn how to produce those sounds and how to listen for those sounds. That's where phonics and spelling patterns make a difference. These need to be explicitly taught. They need to encounter these in meaningful use and culturally responsive context. So that means you may teach them in isolation, but there must also be connection to a real life use for those. So teaching phonics and spelling in isolation is not the best way to do it. You really need to embed it into natural language. And then we move on to grammar and syntax. Now these language patterns should be things that they see daily. And luckily, as I mentioned earlier, early childhood literacy really lends itself very well to repetitive text and to really giving examples of how to use language daily in a way that's accessible to the students. Now, what are some strategies for developing literacy with these young English learners? I'd like you to take a minute and think about how you determine which text you choose for a literacy lesson. Choosing and adapting text for ELLs. Working with thematic units is a wonderful way to help ELLs acquire vocabulary as well as really make connections between texts and concepts. Having text for guided and explicit instruction is going to be of utmost importance, particularly because you will have varied levels of literacy proficiency. Text should be culturally relevant and avoid stereotypes of cultural groups. Sometimes these are things that we're not necessarily aware of, but if in doubt, you might want to consult someone else who might have a outside perspective on whether or not the books in your room are actually amplifying stereotypes of cultural groups. We want language authenticity, so that natural and predictable language that we see in a lot of pattern books and rhythm and rhyme. And once again, illustrations should be very supportive of what the text is trying to convey. So let's talk about those scaffolding techniques and strategies. For difficult texts, definitely read-alouds are very helpful. You can monitor the language, you can stop and talk and discuss, point out vocabulary, ask children comprehension questions, have them predict. They can follow along as you read one sentence, and then you ask them what the next word would be. And if it's a common vocabulary word that you've had, or perhaps a sight word you want them to really learn, this is a perfect opportunity. Picture walks definitely build some background knowledge, help them develop the storyline, and help them understand the story before it's read and they're encountering new vocabulary. Shared reading, audio texts, allowing the students to listen to the text on tape or video on the computer is very helpful, especially if they are listening to the text multiple times. You can have translated summaries. So if there is a text that the student has listened to in class, and perhaps you want them to either preview the text, or if you want the child to take it home, they can have translated summaries, especially if you're just learning new language and you're working at a level where the text is a bit more dense. And definitely graphic organizers are always very helpful for comprehension and vocabulary. And these you can do together as a class. A couple more suggestions. Think alouds while you're doing those read-alouds in class or shared reading or writing. Picture dictionaries and word walls with pictures of key vocabularies. These are wonderful for English learners because concepts come with words and are often represented by pictures. So having visuals to remind them of new words are very helpful. Using props, puppets, or cutouts of characters. That's a great way to have interaction in text. You definitely want to attend to short attention spans. So your stories, as most of you all know, don't have to be very long. And actually, if they're longer than 10 minutes, they're probably too long. Consider small group reading sessions for varied performance levels. Here's a couple of suggestions for engagement during literacy instruction. Have bright visuals in the room. Invite students to bring photos of themselves and their families. Have students bring in their pictures or anything that they like in terms of visuals, and have them help you decorate the room. Here's an example of a word wall with pictures. And if you have enough room and resources, each student can have his or her own word wall depending on their language and vocabulary needs. Here's the fun part. Singing, dancing, chanting, instruments, telling stories. Kids can tell stories to a partner. They can tell stories in small groups, or they can share a story with the class. Playing games, drawing and coloring and painting. Kinesthetic activities. Now we all know that the brain remembers when it's having fun or enjoying an activity. And for English learners, the strategy called total physical response is a wonderful way to get students engaged and help them make those brain connections. As we encourage our students to be imaginative, we also want to be aware that we can't make things too abstract. For English learners, more concrete examples and objects definitely assist their new knowledge and vocabulary and concept building in English. So when we use realia, we're using real everyday objects. Food, toys, puppets, daily items, all of these things that most of us have in our play centers or our imaginary centers. Definitely in our science centers, all these real objects that students can really understand and manipulate and see, touch and feel and interact with. These are what a lot of our English learners can really benefit from. Here's an example of an interactive Venn diagram about summer and winter. So imagine reading a story about summer and winter and comparing the two. Now, instead of writing or drawing a Venn diagram, we're going to make one. And then we can have some writing go with that. That's a truly interactive literacy activity. I want to thank you for joining me in discussing this very important topic. Now that we talked about different things to consider with English learners and some of the strategies that you may already be doing and definitely want to continue doing, I'd like you to consider 3 new understandings about English learners and literacy in early childhood settings. If you'd like to share your 3 new understandings, you can leave me a note under the video, and thanks for watching.